I love it. I have a few colleagues that I visit.
Oh. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our second super exciting Demeter panel. We had one yesterday as well, and it was amazing. We covered 5 other books that have recently been released by Demeter Press, which you can find at demeterpress.org. And so any of the books, just as sort of a preface, and of course I'll circle back to this at the end, anything that you would like to purchase from these interesting topics and explorations, you can do so. And Demeter Press is a great setup in terms of being able to see the contents and seeing everything that you need in that regard. So if you're joining us for the first time tonight, I want to just kind of give a brief lay of the land that unlike traditional author events, this will not be focusing on readings itself, but rather engaging with the editors and writers who have kind of been through a bit of a gauntlet. I think most people feel like when they finally release their work out into the world. And for some people, it's easier than others, of course. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But it's I think for anybody who hasn't been through the process, being whether they're junior scholars or outside of academia, but are interested in stepping in, having that sort of exposure to what this might look like and feel like going through this is super interesting. So we're going to focus a little bit on just process and what it means to be an editor for you and how you got drawn to the topic and all of that. But also feel free to sort of do a deeper dive into some of the questions that may be still unresolved for you or where those tensions may still exist. So we're going to have quite a kind of a movement in and out of different processes and things that go on here. But I'd like to kick us off. We're going to go in the order that was listed on the brochure. So we'll be starting with Maternal Geographies, Mothering in and Out of Place. The second one will be Not Your Penance, which is our only novel. Then we're also going to have Mothering and Entrepreneurship, Perspectives, Identities, and Complexities. Moving Meals will be our fourth one. Moving Meals and Migrating Mothers, Culinary Cultures, Diasporic Dishes, and Familial Foodways. There will also be a second book that's kind of interwoven into that since there's a strong overlap in topic, and that's Mothers and Food, Negotiating Foodways from Maternal Perspectives. And then the last one will be What's in a Name? Perspectives from Non-Biological and Non-Gestational Queer Mothers. So that's the order we're going to present in first. So with no further ado, I'm going to kick this off with Jennifer Johnston and Krista Johnston, who will introduce their book.
Thanks very much. So I'll share my screen just so people can see our book. So there's the back cover from Demeter. Can everyone see that? Is it working? So Jen, I don't know if you wanted to talk first or if I should just kind of give a quick overview of the book.
Well, maybe we could just say where we are in the world and then launch. My name is Jen Johnston. I am an associate professor of women's and gender studies at Laurentian University, which is about 4 hours north of Toronto. And this project, Maternal Geographies, was one that I actually began on a maternity leave, or as I call it, a parental leave, because I do not identify as a mother in the traditional sense. And this book was, however, a labor of love. I'll just throw it to you because there's actually a fire alarm going off in the background at my house, Krista. So I'm going to let you launch.
I can't hear it at all. Okay.
That's good.
So yeah, I'm Krista Johnston, and I'm currently located in Mi'kma'ki on the eastern coast of what's now called Canada. I teach at Mount Allison University in Women's and Gender Studies and Canadian Studies, and we started working together on this book when I was actually in Winnipeg, and so started it there and then finished it when I took up my position at Mount A. And really, our goal with the collection came from Jen's research interest primarily around geography and motherhood studies. And I also have an interest in the impact of geography on social movements in particular. So that's kind of what brought us together to co-edit this book. So really it aimed to bring together motherhood studies and feminist geography and draws on several other disciplines. And we were thrilled in the response to the original call for papers to have submissions that referenced so many different contexts. So the ways that we, oh, kiddo, yeah. The ways that we were able to work with scholars who were in so many different contexts, we thought really enriched the collection. And I think it might make sense to just talk really quickly about how we defined maternal geographies, because this was a concept that we started to work with increasingly as we were working with the submissions and thinking about how to order them. We started really thinking about the ways that there are maternal geographies, that there are pathways to think about the ways that the work of mothering, caring for others happens in space, the ways that those geographies impact on practices of mothering, and the ways that practices of mothering also impact on space. So I don't know if you wanted to, are you okay, Jen? Did you want to talk a bit about the cover image?
Yes, I would very much like to do so. The fire alarm's still going off, but I'm just going to plow ahead. I know there's other adults in the house. So on the cover image, we're going to talk briefly about it because we know that this actually encapsulates one of the things we wanted to achieve in the book, which was to demonstrate how the proximity, one's proximity to a child, in part defines what mothering is. And that is a gendered practice and a racialized practice. So Lizzie Phelps is a contributor to the book as well as an artist, and this is her work. It's called 9 Paces. This work invites us to consider the image of a baby left in a stroller inside an empty garage in an urban laneway. Although the mother photographer was in fact close by, just 9 paces away, this image suggests that just a few feet of space can actually mean, quote, the difference between, ah, look, a mother taking a photo of her baby, and what the hell is she doing? Because she's backing away, obviously, and that's from Phelps' own work. The composition of the photograph incites for us a range of potential concerns and further questions about the relationship between the child and the implied figure of the mother, the viewer, and the connections among them through space and place. So, you know, we are brought to ask, how does one's spatial proximity to children test the definition of mothers, and who can even be named as a mother? And in reference to Phelps' explanation in her chapter in the collection, how is this proximity to children as definitive of motherhood stitched into and written on to various landscapes? So what we do learn about the tenuous connection between mothers and children when they're placed in one locale versus another is that this definition of motherhood is infinitely flexible across space and place. And it may be that these relationships are sustained by personal effort as much as tradition, culture, and the expectations of others. So when we return then to the image itself, we're also prompted to ask, are there mothers who would prefer to move more than 9 paces away in the hopes that someone else will take over? And in a Western capitalist economy, are we, you know, looking at the stroller, for example, and how does that actually stand in for the presence of mother as a culturally specific thing that symbolizes care, primarily through consumption? Because we know there's lots of communities where we just carry our babies around because the streets are, you know, insufficient for rolling a stroller on, and we wouldn't put our babies in that contraption anyway. So it's a culturally specific thing that's mediated through capitalism. So, and furthermore, as a number of the contributors question, who would like to be able to mother, but for any number of reasons is prevented from closing the distance between themselves and the baby? So these are some of the things that we thought about in choosing this image, you know, and comment directly on it in the book, I think relate to a number of the chapters and contributors.
Mm-hmm. So Katie, I don't want to take time away from our other presenters. Should we continue? We could talk about the parts of the book or even the table of contents, but I know there are a lot of folks who want to present their phenomenal work.
Yeah, let's do kind of a brief kind of overview so everybody gets an idea of where everybody's situated in terms of their work and all of that, and then we can circle back and kind of do a deeper dive if that's okay.
Perfect. So I'll stop
Okay.
sharing.
So Rebecca, you're going to be next here. Oh, you're still muted.
Okay. Hi.
There we go.
I'm going to try and share. Okay. Oh, it looks like I can't share content. I do have the Demeter Press page of my book as well, but I can't share it. So we'll just have to think about it. Unless somebody who actually can share content can go to the Demeter Press website and
I can do
and
that
share
right
it.
now.
I don't know if that's okay. Thank you. So I'll just get started while that's happening. So this is, I've written a number of academic publications and co-authored a number of academic publications that were published through Demeter Press, several anthologies, and also a monograph from my PhD thesis, the Looking for Ashley book that I wrote about 5 years ago. This is a novel project that I had been working on for a while, and it certainly is a labor of love, and it's been quite an adventure for me because writing creatively and writing fiction are new for me. So the process was really interesting in terms of, you know, me putting together a manuscript and then working with an editor as well. Thank you. Looks like we're going to be sharing the screen. Thank you so much. So thematically, so by way of background, I'm a lawyer and I have worked as a Crown attorney. And one of the things I found in fictitious portrayals of law, so the way we socially construct stories about law and law in the popular imagination, which are really important sources of law, actually, is something I looked at in my PhD in terms of critical discourse analysis. We very rarely talk about guilty pleas. So I had this interest in transformative and restorative justice, and simultaneously wanted to trouble the sort of way we tell stories about law. So this is a fictitious narrative that centers around the protagonist is a Crown attorney, and it's about a guilty plea. And a guilty plea, when it transpires in court, is a very brief legal proceeding. Not a lot happens. The accused rarely will speak. They may say a few words, but it is a sort of almost perfunctory process. And it involves a lot of silence on the part of the accused. And sometimes there are victim impact statements read, but it's a very brief thing as well. And I really wanted to trouble and unpack the complexity of what goes on in people's lives that underlies guilty pleas. And I also wanted to unpack the complexity of the notion of lawyers as social participants. So in this fictitious narrative, the protagonist, her name is Enid Kimball, ends up being the Crown attorney on someone she used to date as a teenager. So she ends up dealing with his guilty plea, and she shouldn't. It's an ethical breach. So if you're a lawyer, you understand that she's doing something really problematic, and she ends up leaving the practice of law. And there's a lot of there's the journey of her narrative through her childhood, her motherhood, and there's a lot of sort of about mothers and daughters. So it's fiction, so it's different. But I really thematically was interested in fictitious portrayals of law, how we tell stories about law, what are the silences in law? So I provided a very kind of, in part of it, it's quite a detailed and very, very accurate piece, which is the way the guilty plea would actually go, the way a guilty plea would transpire in court, and then wrap this whole kind of life story of her around it. And because the notion is that the law is neutral, that the law is not engaged socially. And so I really wanted to do that. So I hope that it's emotionally evocative and, and it's also sort of a deeply personal story. It's not autobiographical, but I certainly drew on my life experiences for the kind of resonances and truths of it, and just resonating with, speaking of, place. So there's a metaphorical kind of construction or structure of the book around a rock, and it's the Ocotops Rock. And if anybody's from Calgary or nearby or has been there, there's a large glacial erratic in a field. It's big like Stonehenge, but it's there, it's naturally occurring. It's a result of a glacier that moved this rock, so that's in the midst of the prairie. So it's this sort of notion of being out of place and notion of place. And so it's a story that is an Indigenous story that is sort of a framing kind of metaphor for what happens in the story, and also interwoven through this discussion around that troubles the way the law deals with guilty pleas is also the notion of the indigenous stories and occupation of the land and relationship with the land that is underneath all of the sort of colonial settler histories as well. So anyway, there's just a lot going on, but it's a story. And so it was an adventure for me to write it, and I hope that people enjoy reading it. It has its sort of twists and turns, and again, deals with the, notions of law and gender and maternality and the participation of women in the legal profession, and how that's a struggle, and the social roles of mothers. So anyway, the interesting thing about fiction is you can have a lot going on in a very different way. So I think that was what I was going to say about that to start.
Wonderful. Sounds like there's a little something for everybody, for sure. Fascinating. So the next one is Mothering and Entrepreneurship, Perspectives, Identities, and Complexities.
Katie, would I be able to share the screen?
It's Melanie.
I think so. Let me, hold on. Oh no, wait, you should now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
How about now?
Yes, and
okay.
We sort of structured the presentation based on the questions that had been provided, but I think Talia and I are just talking right now about how to reorganize, just so that we kind of meet the new kind of structure here a little bit. So I think Talia's going to start very briefly, just give an intro, and then for me as well, just a one line, and then we can go from there. Is that okay, Katie?
Sure, whatever you would like to do.
Great.
Yes, Melanie, and thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm really happy to be part of this panel. I'm with you all from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and I'm really happy to be representing this side of the world, because very often, and this is part of what motivated this work, very often we have issues related to entrepreneurship, and much of that story and the narratives around that do not capture the dynamics of what obtains in this particular context, and in Caribbean context, and perhaps in East Asian context. And there's a dominant presence, I would believe, of the North American experience around entrepreneurship. And therefore, it does not take into consideration the complexities that we know of and that we work on around entrepreneurship for women, and more so for mothers. And so much of what we were trying to do around this work is, as the first Krista presented earlier, is to really travel this notion of space and the complexities around space. And for some part of this work, we wanted to locate that discussion and that narrative. And in some ways we did that, maybe not directly, but indirectly spoke to the issue of space. And definitely for us, the issue was around context, and how do you situate the relevance of context in understanding the lives of mothers, and how they get involved in entrepreneurship. So it's not just about the involvement, but it's about how they are involved, and where and when, with whom, and at what times, and those decisions around the engagement in the space is very particular to the situations that they face as mothers, as women, in specific contexts. And that for us was very important in how we represent the narratives and the stories of these women and these mothers who are involved in entrepreneurship. And therefore, once we think about context as space, for us it was also very important to talk about place in more symbolic ways. So place is very critical, but it speaks of the meanings and the symbolic representations. And in the Caribbean, for example, when someone says know your place, it's really an indication of you have to understand the meaning that's attached and the expectations that are attached to what you do. And therefore place and space, they are complementary, but the two of them are completely different in how we begin to situate that in our understanding of mothering and entrepreneurship. So for us, it was very important to capture that nuance and the complexities of mothers working within the space of entrepreneurship, but knowing how persons are conceiving their place within that context and how they push back against that in order to engage in that particular space. So I would invite Melanie to go further into some of the contentions that we had around the literature and what we engaged in terms of this work.
Great, thank you, Talia. So we addressed the question of why, well, let me just start. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University, and this project came about, really Talia was the one who initiated it. My work is on sort of racialized women in entrepreneurship, and when she said this, I thought, really, is that, does anyone care about this? But yes, and it took a life of its own, and it's been exciting to look at the contributions and work with the authors on different things. So why do we think this work is important? One of the things for us definitely is a lack of research on mothering and entrepreneurship. But what's important to note here is oftentimes the two literatures, the two fields of research are looked at separately and as something very distinct from one another. And so we felt it was important to bring them back into conversation. And also, the idea of entrepreneurship is often romanticized as something, you know, kind of bootstrap, as something that individuals do, you know, for independence. And we know that for women, it is highly precarious. And so in terms of being solo self-employed, being in feminized professions, and you know, the kind of gig economy is all about this kind of precarious work that is largely, for women, means something very specific. So when you do that kind of work and when it looks that precarious, what does it mean for mothering? And so it isn't something that we engage in entrepreneurship necessarily in a consistent way, in a kind of growth way, but it is present in our lives in different ways. So we felt it was important to really go back and complicate. The second thing I would say, about the entrepreneurship is, as Talia said, context. In entrepreneurship, women's entrepreneurship, gender is centered. And at least in my research, it takes quite a bit, and Talia's as well, and a couple of our contributors, to dislodge that kind of centering of gender and nothing else. And so the book does that. Also, why it's important, I think it's going back to unpaid work. And so you realize in speaking to women who are entrepreneurs, who have businesses in their homes, outside, unpaid work takes a whole different meaning in terms of the most, having to understand it in very nuanced ways. And so the book does that in different contexts around the world, the Caribbean, Canada, the US, the Czech Republic. And lastly, I would say it's important because of the intensification of work and this idea of a kind of individualized, autonomous worker that is free of restraints and restrictions, and that is very much present and hasn't left. So the book, I think, as Talia said, looks at place, context, different histories of oppression that inform a complicated notion of entrepreneurship and mothering. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you. Yeah, let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much. So our fourth book will be Moving Meals and Migrating Mothers, Culinary Cultures, Diasporic Dishes, and Familial Foodways, which is a project that was primarily shepherded by Tanya Cassidy, who could not join us this evening, but somebody who has co-edited with her. And I believe, Florence, you had a piece in that book, correct? Okay, but you also co-edited a different book with Tanya Cassidy, which had a similar theme, and that is Mothers in Food, Negotiating Foodways from Maternal Perspectives. So with the overlay of topics, I feel like you can enter this however you feel is kind of most appropriate for your background and what you'd like to add.
Yes. So do you see the slideshow? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so as Katie mentioned, Tanya could not be with us today. And we mentioned the other book because the last book that she was supposed to talk about, and that will be published next year, is the third in, I won't say a series of volumes that kind of go together, but indeed they do have a common topic, which is mothering and food. And we co-edited the first two volumes together in 2015 and 2016. We do have, like many of the other books, like a fair range of contributors from various cultural contexts, Europe, the US, Canada. We also have people from Brazil. We have chapters on Uganda. So a variety of contexts where we tackle issues of linked to mothers and food. So that's not just diet. So it's not just about health perspectives, but also the cultural aspects of food and issues such as food insecurity, dealing with scarcity, dealing with issues such as food deserts in some places, and so on. So I won't say much more about the 2016 book. I can say more about that when we talk about how COVID-19 has impacted mothers during the pandemic. And as a result, as maybe some of you have noticed as well, there's much more work to do in terms of preparing meals, serving meals at home, in contrast with what would happen in regular situation. But I want to say a few words though about the last book that Tanya co-edited then with one of her colleagues at Maynooth University. So now Tanya is affiliated with Dublin University. If I'm correct. And this one will have a more in-depth exploration of the interplay between the issues of food, families, and migration. So why do we have a third book? Because when we launched the first call for proposals, we received, I would say, between 10 to 40 proposals, and all were relevant and really promising, and we excluded actually very few of the proposals that we received. And we noticed that there was a trend coming back in the chapters that was this idea of migration. So not only do mothers migrate, change from their own birth country and go to another place, but also meals are moving. So foodways move around the world, and some cultures are more uninfluenced and influential. So one typical example that we discuss in the book is fast food. So the Americanization of food is one, but not the only example. So in that volume, we have the introduction and then 10 chapters that are divided into 3 sections. So the first one looks at moving meals, markets, and migrant mothers. So for instance, structural and financial constraints around food for mothers in situation of migration. So what type of food, which they identify as food from home, can they access, for instance. The second part is on performing identity, and this includes national identities for some mothers, especially those that may be in a situation of being refugees in a country which is not their birth country. And in the last part, we have the meanings and experiences of migrant maternal meals. So all of this articulated around not just eating food and not just cooking food, but all the issues around securing food and securing food, which is seen as appropriate, not just in terms of health, but also in terms of culture, which sometimes is putting mothers into very conflicted situations. So the emphasis is on the social, cultural, and economic consideration of migration. Then the food itself, so that's the moving meals, which food symbolize home, and for some mothers, maybe motherhood or the maternal lineage for a few of them, as well as in part 3, the focus is on the family and the family meal in context of migration. We do have a wide geographic representation in this book, just as in the last one. So Europe, we have chapters on Ireland and France. And here I want to mention that one of Tanya's areas of specialization is the donating of breast milk or human milk. And she's worked extensively on food, on milk banks. So the exchange of human milks and the organization of such exchanges in milk banks in Ireland. So that's also what she wrote about. For myself, even though I'm originally from Switzerland, not France, I wrote on the school lunch in France and how this ties to issues of nation, migration, and secularism. So how can the meal served at school either include or exclude some people? Especially around dietary restrictions, which are tied to both culture and religion. We also have examples from the US, from Canada, from New Zealand, and from Nepal. So the chapters take interdisciplinary approaches, and we have really a fair range of contributions. So we take fieldwork data, interviews conducted with migrant mothers, as well as a variety of ethnographic observations. So this is the third book in the series of 3. And I don't know if I can show the other covers again. Now here. So here we can see the 3 of them, and I will just say a few words. So the image that you see in my background is the same image as the second book, and it's by artist Mindy Strike and Jane Jones. And we selected these images because they really reflect this involvement of figures that to us look maternal. Of course, the maternal can look can have many different shapes and forms, but this presence of the mother really in the food, and these are typically children's food, so food served to children, especially the cereals. So I'll stop here. I wish Tanya would be here to say more about the third and last book, but definitely this is a topic that we will have to revisit also due to the situation with the COVID-19 crisis. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And last but very much not least, of course, we have What's in a Name? Perspectives from Non-Biological and Non-Gestational Queer Mothers.
You, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Sherri Martin-Barron. I am myself a non-biological and non-gestational queer mother of 3 children, a 5-year-old and 2 2.5-year-old twins. I teach English to speakers of other languages at the college level. Right now, I'm a visiting instructor in the Writing and Rhetoric department of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. That's in upstate New York in the United States. And then in the summers, I teach at a community college. I teach English as a second language there. Here's the, I don't know if you can see very well. Here's the book. Thank you, I'm very excited. This is my first book. And I feel giddy like a child because like many of you have said, this was a labor of love. And in some ways I feel like I gave birth. So I want to talk about how I came into this project and what its purpose is. So a little over 3 years ago, I had a 2-year-old, and I was struggling to find stories and information and experiences from people that was like myself. And I did find some on Facebook, right? Social media is very useful for that. And I was on a particular group forum one night, probably pretty late, when people were talking about a particular topic, and I think that I was just feeling really frustrated, right? That there wasn't a resource for parents like us, right? For the non-biological, by us, I mean like non-biological and or non-gestational parents who are queer. And so I don't know exactly how to explain it, but I had an epiphany, which was that if there wasn't something out there, that I needed to create it. And so I just boldly decided to go for it. And I posted on this site and I said, this is what I want to do. Does this interest people? Would anyone like to be involved with me? Like, I don't have any experience being an editor or a writer. Would anyone like to help put this resource together? And so my second co-editor, Rachel Johns from Australia, wrote to me right away and said, I'm interested in being an author, but even more, I'm interested in being a co-editor with you. So I thought, wow, like I have a partner in this. She suggested that we reach out to Demeter Press. So I did. I just cold emailed Andrea and I said, hey, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. What do you think? I mean, I had a proposal. And I am just so grateful. And I was just so surprised that she decided that this was a worthwhile project and took us under her wing. We got a third co-editor from Canada, Emily Wills. Unfortunately, my co-editors could not join us today, but they're with us in spirit. We put out a call for contributors. I don't know if we even said no to anybody. Although through the 3-year process, I guess 2.5-year process, once we got contributions, it was whittled down to a few people dropped out. So we ended up with 14. And then about 2 years ago, my co-editors, who themselves wanted to write a chapter, suggested that I write a chapter, which was something I did not intend to do. So for a variety of reasons, including my life is boring. I don't know if I have a story to share. But they were able to talk me through no, you do have a unique perspective and it's worthwhile to share it. And so basically, what is this book? This book is a collection of 15 narrative stories of people who self-identify as either non-biological mothers, non-gestational mothers, or both. Some identify as mothers, some would prefer to be called parents. These are deeply personal, some of them are very intimate stories of people's real lives. And one of my purposes in having a book collection like this was that I wanted to showcase hopeful and positive stories. Because I think that a lot of, I think that there's a lot of sadness and struggle that can come along with being a parent, no matter who you are. I really wanted to focus on the positive, or at the very least, the hopeful. And so I believe that all of these stories are hopeful in some way. They're all narrative. some are just purely narrative, such as my own, which is about my relationship with my oldest daughter, and how I am not the preferred parent, and how that has been a big struggle for me, and pretty agonizing in some moments in my life as a parent. But other stories, but we're very close still. We've come a long way. That's hopeful. And other stories, you know, tell the personal, but also go into, you know, interrogating the legal and the social constructs around being a non-biological and non-gestational parent. You know, relationships with, you know, our own children, relationships with our partners, relationships with society, relationships with the law, relationships with our own fertility, relationships with our bodies, and also one contributor in particular talks about the relationship of specifically the queer community with reproductive technologies. Right? She really does a great analysis and interrogation of artificial reproductive technologies. So I think that might be all I have to say, except that I want to share with you something that one of my contributors shared with me after she received the manuscript that was really powerful, and I think really speaks to what I was hoping to do with this book. I really wanted to be a community resource. And this is what she said. This is a quote. To see some of my experience reflected back to me was profound. You have created the book I have yearned for. Thank you.
It's beautiful. You're going to make us all get all verklempt. It's really, I mean, yes. And I think a lot of you, one of the things that we were talking about a little bit was, you know, what brought you to your books, which I think all of you touched on in various ways. In that sort of, I think one of the things, I was talking about this a little bit earlier with somebody else, that one of the beautiful things about our organization is the way that almost all of us, if not all of us, are living our research, and our research is impacting us. Like there's this really porous quality to what goes on for our work. And of course, you know, stories like that, you know, that I think is exactly what allows our work to be so far reaching in a lot of ways, because these are, it's not just, you know, sort of research done in the ivory tower. This is stuff that impacts real people in very, very real ways. And so with that sort of in mind, what are some of the questions that you think you're asking readers to engage with, or that you're challenging them to grapple with, that maybe wasn't on your radar beforehand and came up through the process, or maybe it's something that you were thinking about all along and went into it and said, you know, this is something that's not, this is an angle that people are not considering. How do you feel like your work sort of interrupts those flows of thinking for other people? And anybody for these questions can chime in however and whenever they want.
Well, if I could, I mean, I think that was sort of central to my thinking behind writing the novel that I did, that the question really thematically is, what does the law miss? When we have the narratives of law, if you have a judicial decision, which, you know, I spent, you know, 20 years reading, or the process in a courtroom, what's not there? What is happening in everyone's lives that isn't there? And the selectiveness of that narrative, what are the silences? What's missing? And how does it not actually deal with justice? And how is justice problematic? And so that's really the sort of the heart of what I was trying to achieve with writing this novel.
I guess I could chime in too. Oh, go ahead, Jen.
No, you go ahead, Krista.
Okay.
No more fire alarm here.
I was going to say in our book, one of the things that was surprising to me was that my perspective has often been on kind of the large structures and systems. So like state policy, citizenship policy. And I was very much attuned to the way that those policies impact on the ways that people are able to make space for themselves and their families, or able to make families. And that certainly surfaced in the submissions from authors, but also what surfaced was that people are engaging with this at such intimate levels. So the playground, the school cafeteria, which Florence, hearing about your work, I was thinking also about those processes that surfaced in a lot of our conversations around the book too. And it kind of helped me to think more about the everydayness of those systems and structures that I maybe get focused on the large movements. And it also opened up a little bit more space for optimism and for hope, because if you can work around a playground or a cafeteria and have such huge impacts for people's day-to-day lives, then I felt like the kind of like state oppressive power, there's some potential also to rethink the creation of space and of collectives.
If I could, while Chris is there, if I could just add to that. So the narrative that we want to interrupt is that we are powerless over space and place. And in every single contributor, I mean, there's people in Brazil, in working from the United States, working from New Zealand, working from Japan, and sometimes engaging with their own migrations within and between countries as well. And you know, in the case of the chapter that I co-authored with my colleague Tracy Gregory, we're looking at the experiences of mothers who are erotic dancers and the way that they reorganize space and are constantly kind of under threat from being discovered within their communities. And so the contributors to that research are constantly managing space and recreating it so that they can control and maintain their relationships to their children. So for me, that is actually that's a labor of love. That's a lot of work as people who are working and also working at the same time. So that was very hopeful for me to see how the participants, whether they identify as biological mothers or not, are making space for their children and their families in incredibly positive ways.
Did anybody else want to chime in here? Sorry, I have my kids are, you may even be hearing that. Sorry about that. It's a block party day today. It's a socially distanced block party. So we decided to move forward and still close off the streets so that the kids could bike in the street and everything. But that just unleashes a whole nother layer of excitement. Anyway. Yeah.
If I could add as well, for us, for Melanie and myself, I think one of the narratives that we really tried to question throughout the book was this notion of underperformance for mothers and women entrepreneurs. And quite often what we see is that when they are evaluated and assessed as entrepreneurs in that capacity, that they are they're using the metrics of scalability and growth, and a lot of that narrative and objectification of mothers and female entrepreneurs do not take into consideration the complexities that they face. In fact, that is essentially dismissed, and there's not that conversation happening about what they are constantly addressing and confronting on a daily basis. And therefore, when you put forward this performance narrative and you evaluate those mothers as underperforming, then it does not take into consideration or even appreciate some of the very complex circumstances and the structured sort of racism and gendered and racialized spaces that they confront, even in addressing their roles and expectations as mothers and as entrepreneurs. So that the book really is about situating those realities for mothers and maternal entrepreneurs and dismissing that evaluation of those women and mothers as underperforming, but really resituating and rethinking of their performance in a more nuanced ways, but in a way that appreciates what they do and what they confront and what they are giving as part of being in the space, is that entrepreneurial space. I don't know, Melanie, if you want to add to that.
Florence? Yeah.
I can say two things. So I just remember now that Jen, I don't know if you can see it because I have this weird background now, but Jen has a chapter in Mothers and Food on space and on the spatiality of the kitchen. So I think this is really interesting that there are so many connections also between notion of space and where you go to eat. And in terms of space and migration, one thing that struck me when I first received the chapters of the contributors, especially when we discussed at the very beginning of the process, the third book, the issues were not just so much that people move, not even where they move from, but how they move across the globe and why. And what I noticed was the difference in experience, even though there were many commonalities, the difference in the experience of mothers who were constrained to leave their home country versus those that chose to leave and then recreated their sense of belonging through food in their new country. And that was something that struck me as some awareness that we should have when we discuss food and migration. So one of the other issue tied to this was the food insecurity and the systems. And that's something that we've seen again with COVID-19, people lining up at food banks and the whole insecurity of the system that is even worse for migrant mothers who might not have really chosen to have this experience of migration, like for instance, asylum seekers who were then granted a refugee status. So that's something that we also address in the book, as well as, and I think a few of you also talked about that, all the discourse around good mothering and also good food. What is that? How is it so culturally defined? And all of these issues that we address, especially in the third book with regard to migration, but also in the first and the second book on mothers and food in particular. So there are so many themes that are intersectional here that it's interesting to have these conversations.
Well, and Florence, you brought up something that I was going to bring to each of you next, is that we're clearly living in very unusual times, and all of you published these books before, I presume, we were even aware of what COVID would be doing to our lives. How do you feel that COVID has perhaps changed or complicated the work that you did? And if you were, not necessarily to do a follow-up book, but if you were to sort of add an addendum to your material, how would you sort of draw in what we know so far of the COVID situation into what you've already put out?
If one thing that, my novel sort of has this, a lot of the action happens around a particular day where the protagonist, who is no longer a lawyer, is a stay-at-home mom, and she's sort of articulating some difficulty, with that notion, and it's not sort of how she perceives her identity, and her kids are getting older and she wants to maybe go back to the practice of law and combine that with caring for kids. In the COVID situation, of course, many of us are doing that all the time, every day, simultaneously. And so that sort of, there's a kind of binary set up there that's implicit that was, you could either be at home with your kids or be, somewhere in an office practicing law. And now, certainly my personal experience for the last number of months has been much like many people with paid jobs, whether it's in the academia or otherwise, here I am, with my kids in the next room while I'm doing this work. And so this paid work. And so that kind of juxtaposition, I tried not to set up that binary between, being a stay-at-home mom and being a mom in the paid workforce, but it's just that COVID reality would be a really interesting kind of addendum there, that obviously the book was written before that. But I think it would be interesting to look at that, because obviously it's and I know that there's a book coming out by Demeter Press about parenting and mothering specifically in the context of COVID. And I think that I have a contribution that's going to be in there about that particular simultaneity. But that's something that would have changed in terms of just the experience. I mean, it's situated in a particular time. It's like 2014 when this is happening. Like everything's happening at a particular time. So that story wouldn't have changed, but there could have been kind of like a sequel.
If I can maybe add to that, Rebecca, and everyone's point, Talia and I, for this question, I think had 2-3 slides. Just couldn't. I think if I were to, I'm just going to take maybe 2 or 3, Talia. I don't, dealing with our children's anxieties, I think for me is much more heightened at the moment than, I don't want to say typical anxieties or issues around. Something is more heightened at the moment that requires different skills, different attention, making sure a different kind of unpaid work that we didn't have to deal with before. I think the idea around, Jen and Krista, you mentioned a little bit, I find the idea of shaming and surveillance is so intensified, even around the debate. Talia and I have been back and forth. But are you sending your children back? And those of us who say yes, it's sort of like, how dare you? And why would you? Jen and Krista, your idea of proximity, it's sort of like, why wouldn't you want them close? And couldn't you, and the gaze is so intensified, and the judgment at the kinds of decisions you need to make for your family, whatever it looks like, that's out the window. I would also say an intensification of class divides for people who say that are racialized and gendered, for people who say, well, keep them home and we're going to hire a tutor. And so you're just like, oh, okay. How's that going to work? And then Rebecca's point to talk about food and feeding them at home and all that. It's all, I find, Talia, I'm sure you and I have been massive, conversations about it, is intensified and reveals just how intense the judgment is on parents, broadly defined on mothers. It's showing itself as, that's what you really think. That I really do need to be anchored. What does it mean to educate your child well at home? Well, I'm sorry, I only have one computer, and online learning's not working today, and and I need to do my job, as Rebecca said. And so, sorry, assignments are gonna have to wait, or whatever you're giving me to do. So you just realize, wait, you want me to do all of that and do it well? So if, Katie, you meant, if we were to go back, I think Talia and I definitely, we had to trim down that slide. We had too much. We just felt like it was, at its peak at the
If I could build on what Melanie has just said, when I think through the chapters in our book, and the fact that COVID has realigned what we consider as domestic space and what we consider as workspace, remembering that some of us have always worked in our homes, proviso. And then I think about some of the chapters where parents, mothers specifically, are monitoring their children in public places. So I'm a white parent of 3 racialized children. I haven't let them out of the house during those months with all of the police violence and then the weird things that people are doing in their heads because they're white middle class people scared of everything in the world. The idea that I would let my brown child go out in this mostly white city and then maybe encounter one of those people who's going on with some kind of narrative about the danger of Black people and then Black Lives Matter being dangerous people really underscores for me when I think about, the several of the chapters dealing with families or mothers or children from marginalized communities in a variety of ways, the idea of public space as scary, scary for whom is being realigned through COVID, because I think we were always aware of that danger of public space as being, the purview of white people to control. And then what role do the mothers of children of color or the parents of children of color have to play in educating our children about how to navigate those spaces? Like, that's a chapter I'd like to write. You know, and I'm also reminded immediately of the chapter that I did not submit to that new collection because I ran out of time. It would have been good. It'll be another project, but the way in which the state has tried to reach back into people's homes. So in the school, some of the school boards locally here in Sudbury, the school boards were actually calling children's aid societies on families that were not having their children attend regularly online schooling. So if your child was not marked as present in the online classroom, they would call CAS. And I think they called it on like 28 families. So here we have a site of surveillance, which is the school. The school is surveilling your parenting. That's mediated through race, through gender, sexuality. Are you a good parent? Are you not? And just, you know, like, we've realigned what space actually is under COVID. And that would be another volume, certainly.
To piggyback on what Jen just said, I mean, you would write an academic piece and I would want some narratives, right, about exactly what you're talking about, right? You know, most of the people who wrote in my book collection, you know, wrote like 2 years ago, right? It's like, that's a long time ago. Especially in the time of the pandemic. So I think that it would be really useful to have, you know, I mean, it's only been a couple years, right? We just got published in September, but you know, just an updated, like, what's going on now in the world, and people's, you know, personal stories about that.
So I did want to let everybody know who is in the audience that you are welcome to chime in with questions as well. There's a Q&A button that you can use. If you're on your computer, you can see it on the bottom, but there's also the chat feature, which I think most of us are quite familiar with. If you're on your cell phone, then usually if you hit the more button on the bottom of the screen, that pulls up your other options, and that should allow you to still engage like you would if you were on a bigger screened device. So I'm going to ask one more question while everybody else thinks of the questions that they want to contribute. And that is, if you could snap your fingers and fix one of the problems that you addressed in your book, what would it be? And you can add the why, of course, that's sort of implied, but like what, and we were, this was sort of a little bit, it was a little bit funny, of course, last night we were saying, I want to change it all, you know, like that sort of answer. But kind of like, clearly you had certain pathways into the work that I presume that, I mean, I know Andrea last night was talking about, like, I wrote this book because I was angry and I felt like I needed this book when I was, you know, a young mom and that sort of thing. But so what, and I likely think that it's something that came from that initial passion, but what kind of came up through that process that you're like, you know, if I could come up with a law, if I could come up with some way to change it and get it done tomorrow, this is what it would be? It's a stumper.
I think I do have a suggestion for one thing I would change. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things in my book in terms of like a bunch of threads of what's missing from legal narratives and what's missing from the legal conversation, the formal legal discourses. But I think the one piece of it is, because it centers around a guilty plea, what would it actually look like to have a transformative process where there's actually a conversation around what happened and people have, you know, a different kind of discussion. We do have some sort of justice processes. People have been talking about them for, you know, 20, 30 years now in our criminal justice process. But I think if we were to reformulate the way that criminal matters are dealt with so that it's more participatory and doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of over-incarceration we see, I think that would be the change that sort of my brain, which is like, they say when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So I'm trained in a particular type of reasoning, which is like, is the law. And so I think of like, let's change the law, because and I hope that's practical.
Other people.
Well, I'll go. I mean, I think probably many of us have the same feeling that if the work of mothering, the work of parenting was valued, and if some of the systems and structures would get out of our way, that would make a huge difference if mothers were able to support one another. I think in our book, I felt like I learned from each of the chapters how mothers engage with making families, sustaining relationships under horrible circumstances, and manage to turn that into, you know, day-to-day love. So I guess maybe all of us might feel the same way, that if we could just value that work and support that work, whatever it looks like, and recognize that it's going to look lots of different ways, that would, I mean, if I could snap my fingers, maybe that's what I would do.
So one of the questions last night that somebody asked that I thought was a great question was if your opinions on anything changed, or viewpoints that you had going into the work changed as you moved through the process of bringing in all these other writers and opinions, and of course shepherding those people through that writing process. Is there something that surprised you, I guess, in that process in terms of your own thinking? Yeah.
So I'm not sure this will exactly answer your question, but I immediately thought about the original call for papers asked for the wording used the word inspiration, like we wanted inspirational pieces. And one of our contributors so very gently, she's a disability activist in Australia, and she so very gently informed me that how the word inspiration and asking someone to be inspirational can be problematic. And that was really eye-opening for me, and I really appreciated the way that she kind of taught me that. And you know, my co-editors and I took that her suggestion very seriously, and we ended up taking that out of you know, the final introduction of the piece and kind of the final overall feel of the book. So that's why I said I wanted it to be positive and hopeful, but I did not use the word inspirational, because I understand now how it can be, you know, problematic.
Do you want to explain perhaps why it might be problematic, or a little bit more with that?
I can try.
Yeah.
So from what this contributor shared with me, you know, as someone who has a disability themselves, they were often like told that they were like brave and so like amazing for doing the most mundane things, like for being able to do the most mundane things, and that the word inspirational gets thrown around a lot, I guess, for in like to people who are disabled in one way or another. And it just has, I guess, my understanding now is that it has quite negative connotations. It's like, oh, look at you, you know, good for you. And it's not meant, like, the way that that's said isn't meant to be like, you know, necessarily positive. It's like made to perhaps make that person feel like they're starting at a less than level. That's my understanding.
Thank you.
Sure.
Did others want to chime in? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to chime in. So one of the things, and I don't think it's a conundrum I necessarily resolve, but one of the things that was a struggle for me in writing the book is I wanted to trouble sort of settler narratives of law and settler narratives of property. And so I wanted to engage in a responsible way with the telling of Indigenous stories, Indigenous mythology. And so that was something I worked with my editor on, to really try to do that in a responsible way and to show allyship
in a way that didn't constitute cultural appropriation. And so certainly the attempt was there, and I talked to some Indigenous people about how to do this appropriately, but it is a kind of a question, you know, particularly when you have things like Joseph Boyden, who, you know, pretended or, you know, claimed, I don't know, but pretended is maybe too strong a word, to have Indigenous heritage. But how do you tell stories that engage, you know, in the context where we have significant overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system in Canada? As a white author, a settler descent, how do I tell stories, even in fictitious form, responsibly? Like if you think of the story, American Dirt came out while I was working on this. And that was a struggle that I worked with quite a bit with my editor in terms of like, how do I do this responsibly and appropriately?
If I could, and I want to think about that storytelling piece that Rebecca mentions, because I think that in the context of telling stories about maternal geographies, motherhood, the M word generally, we do want to be careful not to just rehash narratives that take for granted what people mean by that word. And so like I really appreciated Talia and Melanie, how you highlighted that the decentering of gender was really important to maybe the people you chose to include in the book and so on. And I'm really looking forward to reading all of these texts. And I am looking for stories that decenter gender in interesting ways, because I think the large not secret in the room is that people who identify as mothers do not uniformly identify with that. And the second you're presented with that role or find yourself in that role, that you don't always accept it. So one of the challenges for me in this book was that although I identify as queer and do not easily adopt that identity of mother, in fact, I was the daddy of the first child. It's what the birth certificate had to say, because that was the law. You know, like, so when it came to the inclusion of the material on sort of heteronormative, heteroactivism, I guess, the authors of that chapter really focused on mothers' rights superseding every other right when it comes to like legal frameworks around children. And my experience as someone who studies feminism is really in responding to fathers' rights and the exclusion and elimination of mothers as legal persons for a very long chunk of our history. So I really struggled with that, because even coming out of a queer community, which I sort of consider myself to be part of, I was not tapped into the way that heteroactivism is happening in countries like Poland and in, Uganda and other places where, you know, the reassertion of the family is happening in different ways than how I had studied and learned it, or even experienced it in my specific cultural context. I really struggled with that because it was not a narrative that I wanted to insist upon reasserting the centrality of motherhood as whiteness or as heteronormative. And it was very easy to slip into that if we did not constantly watch for it as editors.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just add something in here, and I'm just sharing one of the encounters that we had with one of our contributors, that in trying to get our title for this particular manuscript and this edited volume, we thought of what's in the name, and this goes back to Sherri's work in terms of the title of your book, but it was so important that how we name what we do and really has implications for how we label certain activities and people in the process. And sometimes as academics, I think that sometimes we implicitly assign label to people and what they do in their lives without being conscious and responsible for that part of the process. So that for me, one of the things that when we looked at mothers who are also entrepreneurs, we thought about the overused word of the mompreneur and mompreneurship. And I remember when we spoke about that, and that was a possible title and how we demystify that, even in putting it out there and with the intention of questioning that naming, one of our contributors, in fact, two of them, co-authors, they were uncomfortable with that name, primarily because the title itself may not give the audience, the reader, the intention around the work. And the concern was, in putting that title out there, are you then setting a framework for a different framework for the book, that we're accepting that naming? And one of the things that they were very keen on, and we were also very keen on, is the fact that the media, the state, they have sensationalized the mother as an entrepreneur. And when you place the mother in the market, then what she does as a mother become commodified in the process. So that how do you treat with motherhood, mothering, and how the market seems to recalibrate and reframe and rethink how that happens and how that becomes labeled in the process, and how that becomes a vantage point to sell, all right? And to sell what mothers do and how they do it, and how that process becomes the emphasis, and then we get lost in the commodification of that, and not necessarily the struggles that are primarily and essentially what this is based on. So for us, it's really centering the struggle and not sensationalizing and capitalizing on motherhood and mothering and mompreneurship as it is promoted in this particular space, which is essentially the market.
I could talk about that with you all night. That is so fascinating. But yes, and I still need, like, I'm about 3 seconds behind on my question here. So I'm gonna hand this over to Florence.
Yeah, I just want to add something. So the thing that struck me as very important in the two books actually is the contrast between, in some chapters, a form of celebration of domesticity in some discourses that were then analyzed, and especially those that wrote from context where I would say gender norms are not challenged to the same extent as they may be in other places. So this celebration of domesticity, which is then highlighted as an issue, and in other chapters, this deconstruction of mother as the home cook, and issues around food, not just in the home, but elsewhere. So this contrast between, on the one hand, I would say a discourse that is not challenging this constructed norm that the mother should cook, and on the other hand, these creative ways that authors, I would say especially through the narratives they get from their informants, show that yes, migrant mothers especially have found ways to both still transmit what they want to transmit to their children in terms of culture, but also through disrupting the gender norms that only women or only mothers should cook in their own context as communities of migrant mothers. So that's in some of the chapters, it's not in all of them, but this contrast really struck me as important to mention here.
So I think that, let me see here. There is one question here. I'm curious about dissemination. Have the audiences you wanted to read your books done so? Do you feel that you've had the reach that you wanted? And if so, how? If not, what could we do as motherhood scholars differently to broaden our audience? And that actually feeds really, because I was thinking of my final question at the last time, and I hope I'm not stepping on Michelle's toes here by inserting a second kind of add on to that, but that is sort of like, so if with this intended audience that you may or may not have reached, what actions would you like them to take, or how would you like them to, whether it's changing their own lives or engaging in their communities differently, any of those different things, like how do you not only, what would you wish for these people to do differently, and do you feel like you're reaching those people, which I think was her question.
If I could just like leap on that one, because thank you for asking it. It is always the loneliest place in the world to finish a piece of work and then you just drop it out there and you don't know. And conversations could be happening about your work in places that you least expect. For my part, it's been really important to me to take this work to write to specific audiences. So for example, at our university, we have one of the 3 midwifery programs in the province. And so we'll be doing some work there. And it's, I have the good fortune of having some of those students in one of my thesis classes. So we'll be able to do some reading there as well. Particularly as there are now a number of non-binary identifying midwifery students in that program. There always have been, you know, people who are not conventionally gendered, but who are really looking for and pushing for that language. And I think for some of my co-contributors and other you know, some of the chapters involve methodologies, like how do you do research as someone who looks like a mother or who resists those narratives of being a mother. And I think that we all have to take, especially in edited collections, you have to encourage your contributors to take those chapters, take those pieces, give them a framework presentation, but really encourage people to take it to those individual audiences. I think that's one of the best things you can do as a co-editor. Have we done that adequately yet? No, but it's what we will be doing and what we would ideally be doing to support our contributors. Thank you.
If I can jump in as well, then. So my book as a novel is a little bit different. And so there's a wide range of intended audiences. It's sort of, I think it would have, in terms of like my hope for action from the legal profession, would be to really look at those absences from legal discourse, but also absences from the legal profession. We have, and it relates to the paid work I do, we have a significant issue with respect to attrition of women from the legal profession within 5 years of starting to practice. And a lot of women that I graduated with are no longer practicing law. And there was a really interesting story about the other women who went to law school with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and where they ended up in their careers and that type of thing. And so one of the questions would be, you know, the legal profession, and specifically how are various barriers, whether gender or racism or you know, indigeneity in the Canadian context particularly, how are those dimensions absent from the conversations about law and from who is involved in practicing law and what positions people are in with respect to the law. So I think that I would want people to think about that. I also, one of the pieces that's sort of more general, because it is that fictional narrative, is for wealthy white women to critically interrogate where they are and what they are doing, and to really, you know, the protagonist, you know, is sort of trying to trouble that in herself and sort of look at her voice and look at her responsibility in a different way. And I think that that's kind of, I want it to be unsettling. I want the whole book to be unsettling. And that's what I hope. And I noticed that the new distributor for Demeter Press it's available in Walmart, it's available in Target. And so I think, I kind of hope it sneaks up on some people who are just kind of like reading some fiction, and it's sort of unsettling for the readers who are maybe sort of unprepared for that idea and think, wow, well, wait a second, how am I positioned in a different way?
Just want to add to Rebecca's point quickly. I see sort of everyday ways in which interventions can be made, and Jen's point of not seeing this as sort of a niche type of scholarship, but even we have midwifery as well, but I think it should be included in our policy PhD program, or in a variety of disciplines. We have a food security certificate. And so I think it needs to be infused everywhere. And so encouraging people and our colleagues to do that. And the everyday way for me that I've been trying, and it may be small, but I think it speaks to Rebecca's kind of questions around silencing and absences, and it is to constantly remind people of this world. Even if you have no interest in it, or it isn't yours, or you're not a parent, or you're not, okay, but you remind me in a variety of ways of your, right? Please email me now, Or when will you get, you remind me in so many ways of what matters to you. So my emails now are just, as a result of childcare or a lack of childcare, I am, right? And so I'm purposefully injecting that in conversations as kind of, I'm fine if it isn't your everyday. And I'm fine if you don't understand, but it is mine. And it does kind of influence my everyday practices and my community. So I think the silencing is also problematic, that we're in our homes, that we're, right? We sort of, it's just with parents that we kind of talk about these things, certain parents. I think that needs to change as well. And so my department meetings, I'm constantly, no, I have to go, I have, or whatever. Can't we change this meeting? Yeah, yes, we need to change the time. It doesn't work. And here's why. And so.
Or have fewer meetings.
Or have fewer meetings. But that's gotten off the table, I find. We tend to accommodate as opposed to have the structures accommodate us.
Okay, well, I think that we've hit our time limit, unfortunately, unless anybody has, you quick raise your hand if you have a closing thought that we didn't get to. Yes, Jen?
I want to say thank you to Andrea O'Reilly for pushing, pushing, pushing.
She is a force to be reckoned with, for sure, and in all the most positive ways. It is, and she is a force of nature that I was going to thank her again. I know that she was in the audience, rooting all of you on, and I am so thankful for the work that she has done in shepherding these books and making sure that when she talks about sometimes on social media about yet another grant application that she has submitted, and the hours and hours that have gone in to securing the funding and reaching out and trying to get all of your voices out into the world to help make that impact that I know is so vital. I think that it's absolutely just amazing that she has continued this work so successfully. And so, as I said at the beginning of this meeting, the session, I did want to highlight that the best way to support small presses like this is to purchase the books that those presses are putting out. And I know that you will not be disappointed in what comes. I have a full collection of Demeter Press books that I return to very frequently when I'm looking for, whether it's to do a lit review or just be like, hey, I remember that. I just, I can pull it right off and, go revisit things, use them in my classes, do all sorts of different things. And certainly I know that having those purchases being done specifically through Demeter Press and not through a third-party source is absolutely vital to get the funding where it needs to be. So that link is in the chat box, but of course, demeterpress.org. You are welcome to go directly there and purchase all of these books from these wonderful editors that have been so gracious with their time and insight. And I thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.